Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. This week, we're on the final bake for our Jesus Loves You series. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Alex, and my pronouns are he and him.
Today, we'll continue our Jesus Loves You series with today's Rye and Shine episode. In this episode, we'll discuss the 13th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 21, or Proper 16, which this year falls on August 22nd. We do have some content notifications for you for this episode. In the first reading, we discuss colonization and manifest destiny. In the second reading, we discuss militarization. And in the gospel reading, we discuss cannibalism and anti-Muslim violence.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Today, for our deep dive, our special guest is Pastor Alex Raby. Alex is a Lutheran pastor who loves cream soda, greyhounds, French pastries, and Jesus, but not in that order. He currently lives in Long Island and is the pastor of Oceanside Lutheran Church, a spunky congregation of the ELCA. Alex, you have been baking a lot and posting a ton on Instagram with the hashtag #GayBaker. When did you start getting into baking?
I got into baking when I was a toddler, and I helped my mom make bread. She let me help her knead, and by that it meant poking belly button holes into the bread. So I got to use my fingers and poke into the bread, which was my contribution to helping my mother. So it's been a part of my life forever. But the thing that got me into what you see on my Instagram mostly is from being in college, I fell in love with Jenny's Splendid Ice Cream from Columbus, Ohio, which is near where I went to college. And oh my God, it's so good. Jenny is a flavor wizard, truly. And like, I have her cookbooks, and I like went to her book signing because I was so obsessed with her. And she had this whole section in her first cookbook about flavor and how she discovers flavor through travel. And so she'll go places and just smell the town that she's in and taste all the food that she can. And it really, it spoke to me in such a profound way because she didn't just eat things. She experienced them. Like, it was like a spiritual thing for her. And so it's like posh ice cream. So it's accessible, it's gourmet, it's delicious and bougie all at the same time, which is very much my lifestyle, I think. So having Jenny's got me into the realm of sort of gourmet, delicious, tasty, amazing food. And so that, combined with my history and passion for baking, like through my whole life, got me into this place of hashtag gay baking. And that started, I was looking through my Instagram before this, and that started on February 28th, 2017 was my first gay baker hashtag on Instagram, because I was making macarons. And there's this whole story on that.
As opposed to macaroons.
Right. I was making macarons, which is French, and macaroons are not. Macaroons are made of coconut, and macarons are made out of almond flour and egg whites, and they're vastly different cookies. And
they're part of a family recipe for me, so I know that one.
Your macaroons are a family recipe?
Macarons.
Your macarons.
Stale ones only, but yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I'm going to need this recipe after this is over. So I was making macarons, and I am good at it. Like, I'm relatively naturally gifted at making macarons, and
which is impressive.
Yeah, truly, because they're difficult. Like, my husband and I were taking a baking class at a culinary school together once, and we made macarons, and I was one of like 4 people that was able to make them. Like, and so many of them were just like pooling on the baking trays and like flat or like overly high, and it was. And the, teacher came up to me and was like, "These are perfect." And I was like, "Well, thank you very much," because I knew that they were.
So are you saying that Mary Berry would like nod her head if she ate one of yours, or would she nod her head and smile?
I think now she would nod and smile, because the whole point about that macaron story is that I was making macarons and I did it wrong. Like, I whipped the egg whites too long, and you have to fold the almond flour into the egg whites and sort of mush it up against the side of the bowl. And then you get these like ribbons that fall down. And I always stop too early. Like I would second guess myself and I'd say, I don't want it to deflate. So I'd rather have like a slightly puffy macaron than one that's going to just deflate into nothingness. And so the whole thing for me was this intentionality behind baking then, and saying like, it's okay to make mistakes. First of all, I don't have to be perfect at everything. And second of all, I have to trust the ingredients. I can't just say, I know best. And I can't just say, you have to stir it 50 times like some of the recipes say. You have to look at it and you have to feel it and you have to see it and experience those ingredients to know when they're ready. And that batch that's on the Instagram, I was not ready with. But since then have learned how to trust myself a little bit more.
That's fantastic. Speaking of this, so we began this series, our Jesus Loves You series, with mutual aid, and then we dove into sourdough baking with Micah Luagi. And you generally do a more desserty type of baking, French pastries, for example. But also one of the things that has happened during the pandemic is that many of us have experienced how we have expanded how we understand communion and what communion is and what like counts as communion. For example, I have used everything from carrots to donuts to blueberry pancakes or coffee and water and smoothies for communion. So I'm curious how your baking, especially the kind that is like delightful, connects for you with communion and like this concept, this larger concept that we're dealing with in this series of Jesus as the bread of life.
So I hope you've talked about the Enneagram on this podcast before. Have you?
Occasionally.
Okay.
We have not done a deep dive into the Enneagram, but
there's like at least it's come up, so it's not totally foreign. Okay, so I'm an Enneagram 7, which means that I am the joyful person, or the enthusiast, or the celebratory person. So like my whole being in life is to experience joy in all its forms, which is a lot of fun to be that person. And so I think like that for me is where I connect this. Like, I think that the Enneagram has like an intensely spiritual aspect to it. There's also harmful parts of it, but like we can get into that in another episode. So the parts that are good though are great. And I know that God wants me to be happy, and making and eating pastries makes me very happy. And so I think like that's part of my spirituality, is experiencing joy. You know, when I was on internship, my supervisor said that I have the spiritual gift of joy, and that sort of shocked her that we would work well together, because she does not have the spiritual gift of joy. But so when I experience joy, that's me experiencing the love of God. So that's sort of how I feel about that. You know,
Alex, I feel like I have to ask, with the hashtag gay baker being your tagline, you might say, do you have stories about rainbow bakes that you've done?
I don't actually love rainbows. I really love rainbows for, what is it, 30 days has September, April, June, and so the 30 days of June is when I like really enjoy rainbows. So that's my rainbow story. I don't have any, but I do love rainbow cookies. I have found this in New York. I'm not a New York native, and I'm not an Italian, and Long Islanders love their Italian cookies, you know. So rainbow cookies they're supposed to be the Italian flag. There's like a layer of red, a layer of white, and a layer of green, and it's almond cake that's like a quarter-inch thick, and then there's raspberry jam in between the layers, and then it's covered in dark chocolate ganache, and oh my gosh, they're so good. They're the best cookies not the best. I can't pick a best cookie, but like, why are these like hidden in Long Island with the Italians? Like, why don't Ohio Germans get to have any of these? I've never made them.
I feel like there's a wonderful story about the coming out of rainbow cookies to Ohio that.
Yeah, I think I've got to find a way to market these to the Midwest somehow. But they're like, it's like a classic, and people make cakes out of them. Like you make like a full size cake that looks like a rainbow cookie, and like there's rainbow cookie ice cream and rainbow cookie Italian ice. Like it's like just such a huge thing, part of this culture, and I think that everyone needs them. And I haven't tried making them yet, in part because I live here and I can buy them easily from bakers who make them really well. But I want to try them sometime. So it's the people that I know that make them at church say that they are the most labor intensive thing, because it's making these like
they sound labor intensive,
really thin pieces of cake, and then like a tiny knife to spread the raspberry jam on them, and like all sorts of things. So,
but also you're apparently used to making macarons, so
touche.
What is hard for some might not be hard for you.
Touche.
So does that mean you don't have a recipe to share with us for that? I'm just going to try and get recipes for every single thing
I don't have a rainbow flag recipe, but you could probably find them on the Googles.
That's what I figured.
Most of the things I bake actually come from King Arthur flour, which I don't know if you've talked about on this podcast yet in your baking.
We have not.
But I think it got a passing mention, but that was about it.
Yeah, it got a slight mention from in our sourdough episode, I think, with Micah.
Yeah, so like, I mean, I'm not being paid by them, so I don't know, like, do you do, like, is there, like, a way to get sponsorship from them? Because they're a great company.
I think we would have had to be a little bit more intentional before this series came out. And then they probably would have, like...
And, like, if our listener base was in the triple digits, we might have a shot, but...
Right. I do know that they do a lot of good work with a friend of Emily and mine, that they donate a ton of stuff to fundraising efforts for a friend of ours who does a feeding ministry in Vermont.
Oh, cool. I didn't realize that for Jam.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that they did that for Jam. That's awesome.
Yeah. I was talking to Jam about King Arthur, and it came up, and I was like, that's amazing that they do that, and have been just super helpful with the fundraisers for that, because it's a company that's it's a co-op company, so it's owned by the employees, 100% employee owned, and so they like actually care about things more than just profits. You know, they're still corporations, so they like their profits, but you know, it's a good company in that way, I think. And like they have so much online. They have a baker's hotline. If you are baking something and you don't know, like something goes completely awry, like you're making a buttercream frosting and you're awry! Awry!
Yes!
You told me to work it in, and I didn't even plan that one. So if you're like making like an Italian buttercream or something, and you're like, you know, you like say you didn't boil the sugar enough and it's like chunky, you can call the baker's hotline and tell them what you're doing, and they'll try to help you troubleshoot it, or just be like, yeah, you failed at that, maybe just do it again, but do it right that time. But mostly they try to help you. It's like you know how like Butterball has the turkey hotline at Thanksgiving?
Yes.
This is like a all year round hotline that when you're baking stuff, if you have questions about baking, you can call them and they will help you through it, because they've got like professional bakers that answer these phones. And it's super cool.
Aww.
It's super cool. They also do have all of their recipes by weight and volume. You can choose.
Ooh.
Excellent.
And
that's awesome, because a lot of people do weight, and
a lot of people
just don't have scales.
Well, that's in the United States, most people write recipes by volume, which is not a good thing. I mean, it's fine if you don't have a scale.
Because you can like tap stuff down and then it like condenses. My bread recipe that I have like 5-minute artisan bread recipes, and they're like, no, you have to do the like scrape and whatever and not tap it down. Like scoop and
the 5-minute artisan bread, I think, is just you just scoop it. Like you
scoop it and then you clear it off though. Like you get a knife or whatever to clear it off.
Yeah, you don't want a heaping cup or something.
Yeah, they wrote those authors of that cookbook wrote their recipe for the scoop method because it weighs differently. Yeah. Like Like, I think that where was I just was looking this up.
As opposed to if you pack the flour into the cup, then it will be packed tighter and there will be more.
Yeah, you'll have more flour.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's
Which
like
apparently
200
is a thing people do, but I was totally taught the scoop method myself.
Right.
I was taught like scoop and then shake it flat. Which
So like
packs it in.
Fair.
So when I've been when I read American recipes that have like at least some knowledge of this, they talk about spooning the flour into the cup and then leveling it off. Like scooping is actually like the worst thing you can do because it's the heaviest, because it compacts it even more. So that's why, because you can have a cup of flour, if you've scooped it, weighs like, say, I don't know, 200 grams. If you pour if you like sift the flour into it, it can be like 150 grams. And that's like a vast amount of difference in weight for flour. And so that's why I like the King Arthur recipes and also European recipes and British recipes, because they do it by weight and it makes it more precise. Because if a recipe says 230 grams of flour, it doesn't matter. You just put your bowl on the scale and like put the flour until it's 230 grams, as opposed to a cup which maybe is 200 and maybe is 150 and maybe is 265. So there's less margin of error when you're baking by weight.
Yeah, that feels really precise and like fancy of you.
Yes.
Well, that's what baking is, though. Like, especially with pastry, and stuff. Like, you can't. So, people love cooking because they can just sort of throw some extra salt in the pan or, taste it and say, oh, this needs a splash of balsamic vinegar or, whatever. But you can't just splash in balsamic vinegar to a chocolate chip cookie recipe. You gotta know if
Please
it's...
don't. That would be a terrible
I
idea.
I bet Alex could make one that's good. But
I don't know. We'll see. I'll work on something.
If you get the sweet enough balsamic vinegar,
and really bitter chocolate.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know.
Work.
I'll work on this for my life.
But you've got a few weeks before this episode comes out.
Yeah, maybe by the time it comes out, I'll have it perfected. That was a terrible example. So
I think what you were going for is the idea that cooking is an art and baking is a science.
Yes.
And my personal favorite version of that is that baking bread is a science with added prayer.
Yes.
Because it's even more difficult.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. You can't put 3 eggs in a recipe that calls for 2 eggs that you're baking because you feel like putting 3 eggs in, because it will totally ruin it. If you're making a shakshuka or something that you're cooking and you're like, oh, I want 3 eggs in this, you're fine to do that because it's not going to ruin it.
Yeah.
But it could totally mess up. Yeah, that's there's the picture of chocolate chip cookies and it's this picture means you had too much egg. This picture means you had too much sugar. This picture means you had too much of this. And
Yeah.
The first time I made my grandmother's spritz cookie recipe, I believed that she had written it down wrong and I was about to add more egg. But it turns out, no, you're not supposed to add more egg. It really is just like concrete to stir and you honestly can't use a mixer for it. You have to hand stir it because it's just that thick. And yeah, that was quite a lesson.
Now, did your grandmother's recipe use margarine or butter?
Oh, no, butter.
Okay, good.
Grandma was really not a margarine person, so.
That's wonderful, because a lot of my grandma's recipes were margarine based because Midwest Ohio sort of save the money.
Well, and margarine was cheaper for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. And so mostly it wasn't butter, and butter and margarine bake totally differently because they're different substances.
I believe that Grandma did use margarine for several years there, but then later on she converted all of her recipes to butter so that she wouldn't have to continue admitting that she had used margarine. Because she was never going to share a recipe that had margarine in it. That is not something she was going to do. So
that's amazing.
That's fantastic.
I love that.
Yeah.
So Alex, a lot of baking has been, and the stuff that's been coming out about baking during the pandemic has been largely a privileged, the people who have not had to go into work and have had more time and all of this stuff.
Really big, expansive kitchens.
Big, expansive kitchens. All it feels a lot like even the self-care industry type of thing where it's a commercializing of see, buy this flour, buy these things, bake these things, try these, like, buy all these new baking things for the pandemic and see what happens. So I'm curious how you have experienced it, particularly as someone who has been baking before the pandemic started, but also, like, how do you experience, like, the privilege of being able to, like, bake fancy baked goods? Is it all just privilege? Is it more complicated? I mean, I assume it's more complicated because life is more complicated than that, but
life is never a simple yes or no answer, is it?
Right?
You know, there was an article that came out at the beginning of the pandemic that this lady was so pissed at everyone for taking her yeast from the grocery store because commercial yeast stopped being available, and people were starting to bake because also bread wasn't available. Like, you know, if you remember, like, there was grocery stores like looked like Soviet Russia in the 50s, like, you know, like, or like The Handmaid's Tale, you know, like where there's like a can of tuna on the shelves. And so this lady like wrote this scathing article about how all of these hipsters were stealing her yeast and she made bread to survive. And like, it takes a lot of privilege to write a blog post about that, to have the time to write a blog post about how you need to make bread to survive, because most people who are making bread to survive don't write blog posts about that. And that's then what got people into sourdough, because sourdough is natural yeast and you can just capture it from the air. But I think that you have a good point that part of the pandemic baking thing was a privileged part of our pandemic situation, that there were people that had to still go to work, that couldn't bake, that live in efficiency apartments, that don't have a full oven, you know, that sort of thing. And I don't know where I'm going with that, even a little bit.
I do think it's privilege. I also, like, I mean, full disclosure, I got into baking bread, and it was this saves a lot of money to have, like, good bread that I can make in bulk. And I've been working through the whole pandemic. Like, one of my jobs I can do kind of from home sometimes. The other job I literally have to be at a hospital for. And so, like, in the space of what is the privilege of not working during a pandemic or working differently during a pandemic, like, I inhabit all of those spaces.
Right.
And baking for me was also this, like, breaking open space a little bit. Like, there was a way that it was, like, a privilege to be able to, like, take that time and just be like, you know what, I'm going to bake. And I had roommates for most of the pandemic. And so that was also part of, like, shared time, and we cooked for each other. And so had more time available. When I'm currently living by myself, like, I don't have as much time because I have to be responsible for my food every single day.
Right.
Which is, like, harder to do. So, yeah, so, like,
right.
I resonate with that, like, yes, there's privilege. Also,
yeah, and I think that there's sort of, you know, there's these questions of privilege and access and also, like, intention, you know. So in pandemic world, like, early pandemic world, you know, everyone was like, well, you have plenty of time, why don't you learn French? And I'm like, I don't have the brain capacity to learn French right now. Like, we're in a pandemic. So there's, you know, there's folks that learned how to bake because they had the privilege and the time to do so. But what isn't privilege for a privileged person? You know, that, like, is already in that realm anyway. And so that's what, so there's, you know, there's a little, and there is some crossover there, you know, with you, like, that it became sort of both. You know, you had time for some things, and then you were also using it to cut costs because people suffered financially during the pandemic too. So, you know, I think it's a little bit messy. For me, baking was actually harder during the pandemic because I didn't have anyone to give it to. So that's like, I could eat like a dozen eclairs in one sitting, like, without even thinking about it. Like, truly, like, you know, broke up with somebody in college and ate a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts, and, like, then realized a little bit later that I had done so. And
again, with the digestive system and a week of cake.
Truly. So, you know, when I make stuff, I don't know how to make small portions, and also baked goods don't make small portions. You can sometimes cut a recipe in half, but rarely less than that. And there's people who are better at science than me about, like, scaling recipes up and down, that you actually use more or less of some ingredients sometimes based on the amount that you're making. So it's not just cutting something in half or just doubling it. Sometimes it needs a little bit different adjustment. But, you know,
and it's kind of hard to use 3/4 of an egg.
Right. And then you're like, it's hard to cut in half. usually would just use 2, and it's generally okay-ish. But
That's what my dad told me for that recipe.
Yeah, generally okay-ish. But, when I bake stuff, like when I make croissants or I made sfogliatelle in the pandemic, which are these
I like that you pronounce things like, well,
you have to. So sfogliatelle they're like lobster tails. An Italian from Long Island is probably like standing outside my door right now screaming that I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but that's how I think you pronounce it. Yeah, they always say like just pronounce something with a lot of like gusto and everyone will believe that that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. So I made these pastries and it's a laminated dough and it's got this semolina flour, ricotta, orange zest filling. And you make this dough and then you kind of fold it out so that it fans out and it's supposed to look like a lobster tail. It doesn't really look like a lobster tail, but like none of these pastries that are supposed to look like things do, because it's just somebody's like...
It's like the constellations don't actually...
Yeah, right. Like,
those animals.
Exactly. Like, what is that? That's not a bear. Like... So I made these, and the recipe made 24 of them, and you really couldn't have it. You couldn't cut it in half. And so I did with laminated pastries, you can actually freeze them before you bake them pretty easily. So I still have 12 of these pastries in my freezer that are probably now bad, like, because things don't last forever in a freezer.
What? Things last forever in freezers? I don't know what you're talking about.
The Sims taught me that years ago.
Ooh. When my grandmother died, she had strawberries from 1997 in her freezer, and she died in the mid-2010s. Wow. And my mom was cleaning out this freezer, and they were literally freeze-dried. So things do get bad in a freezer after 30-plus years.
Yeah. Okay, fair.
Professionally freeze-dried.
30-plus years.
Right, like, there's a difference between freeze-dried in, like, a deep freeze for 30 years in a grandma's basement and freeze-dried in a, like, professional food place that does it over the course of a day with, like, liquid nitrogen and stuff.
I guess.
So anyway, the thing that was hard about baking in the pandemic for me is that I couldn't give it away. And so it was, like, problematic for my waist size, like... It was problematic for my health because I was eating too much, but also it was problematic for me because I couldn't share it with other people. So that's one of the things that I really like about baking is that I get to give it away. And so much so that, my husband and I have been talking about this as a self-care thing, that baking is self-care for me, and that, I can make something and I don't actually have to eat it all. I can give it away to people, and that actually then makes me it helps to connect me to them, and it breaks down this hyper-individualist society that we live in, and it means we don't have to hoard it all, and we get to see that there's more than enough in our life, and we can share it. And so when I was working at home, and my husband was working at home, none of us were going to the office. Like, we just had baked goods, and it was awful. Like, I mean, it was great, don't get me wrong, but, like... Ultimately, like, it didn't fulfill what baking fulfills for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think there is the space of baking is a thing that feeds us, and that it is good to have things that taste good, right? There's this terrible idea within capitalism that, like, poor people don't deserve things that taste good or things that are nice. And that's how, like, so many people justify, like, restricting SNAP benefits and restricting kind of all of the different safety nets that we have for people who are victims of capitalism. And also, like, there's a space of, like, pushing out beyond ourselves. And I think I really love that, because I always love receiving I've gotten baked goods from people, and sometimes, like, they'll mail them, and then they come and they, like, give me a bunch of different baked goods. And one of them is just, like, too moist, and so then, like, the other ones are a little bit mushy. Baked goods never mail perfectly.
No, they certainly don't.
But there's also always, like, this love and this appreciation and this delight at, like, receiving baked goods, whether it's in the mail and imperfectly or in person. And then also, like, to be able to share the couple times that I have made, like, big batches of things. And I'm like, I made a chocolate cake the other week. just for fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought it to our like Wednesday night Taco Wednesdays, which is like my Pandemic Pods weekly thing.
Mm-hmm.
And people loved it. I had forgotten how to cut a cake, so it was like falling apart when I took the leftovers home, but it was
But that's
it
all
was
right. You just throw that in a
like,
blender with some ice cream, you get a chocolate cake milkshake.
Have you ever been to Portillo's?
I have, but I've never got. Yeah, I went to Portillo's all the time when I was in Chicago, but I never got the chocolate cake shake because I'm slightly lactose intolerant, and that's like a bit much.
Yeah, I'm lactose intolerant too, but I did have one before I found out that was what was going on with my body, and it was fantastic.
I refuse to admit to any of that sort of heresy.
I'm going to Chicago next month, so I am gonna take like a carton of Lactaid and try one because I need to, you know.
Yes.
There's a place here called Zombie Burgers, and they have a variety of different shakes. Some of them are like cake shakes.
Mm-hmm. You know, the thing about capitalism, like that this thing sparks to me about that poor people can't have nice things, right? Is that like it costs literally less than $1 to make a batch of profiteroles, which is like the same dough that you use to make eclairs. And like if you're going to put pastry cream into them, because it's eggs and flour and butter and some salt, like, and if you're going to put pastry cream in it, you need like some whipping cream, which is like $2 a carton, is $2.99 in New York. So like, I don't know, less than that where there are cows. You know, and some like powdered sugar, and that's all you need, really. Like baking is incredibly inexpensive, but it takes a lot of time, and so that's part of where this comes in. Space and expertise when you're doing like particularly difficult pastries, and so that's why you get these pastries that cost $5, $6, $7, $8 a piece, because you know you want to be able to pay the people that are making them a wage that they can live off as well. You know, is a cronut from Dominique Ansel in Soho in New York worth the $8? Like, I don't know, but is an eclair in Paris that costs €3 worth it? Probably, because it's made with good ingredients, it's made with time, it's made by somebody who makes a living wage, you know. So that's something that I think about too with this. And I just discovered with thinking about this, you know, what do people deserve? It's something I learned about 4 days ago, in one of my Google rabbit holes that I fell down, that there is an app called Too Good To Go. And I actually found about it on Reddit from somebody who posted a picture of a New York restaurant throwing away a trash bag full of bagels. And they were mad about that because it was a sin in New York to throw away that many bagels, but also because people could eat them. And so this app, it's also a website, Too Good To Go. It's toogoodtogo.org. And you can, restaurants and food service establishments can like sign up to be part of it. And they can then at the end of the day put stuff on this app, whether it's like baked goods or groceries or ready to eat stuff or like meals. And they sell it to people for like no money, like super, super cheap, like discount just to get rid of it without throwing it away. And so it's like, it's sort of like an alternate economy for stuff. And this Reddit was a New York subthread in Reddit. And so it was like, some of these people were talking about getting like insane New York posh foodie food for, you know, less than $10 a meal, which in New York is like a bargain.
Yeah. That's fascinating because in our first episode for this series, we talked to Pete, who's part of North Des Moines Mutual Aid, and he talked some about food rescue stuff, and they do a lot of they do breakfast about twice a month, every other week, in one of the neighborhoods in Des Moines, and they have like a community fridge that they run, and so they have. We're talking about like the gift of food rescue, that you can get stuff that is just like extra that the grocery store has or that sort of thing. A lot of times it is like on the verge of expiration, and then you have to be really clear about like, we're not giving people expired food. Like that's not what mutual aid is about. That's not what a community fridge is about. But there is a space of when there's extra food, making sure it gets to people who need food to eat. And when there's food that's like on the verge that maybe isn't good enough to give to people, but is like good enough to cook in something. So then if you're going to make a community meal anyway, you take that food and you figure out how to make it into a meal for the community meal. And so I think like that's that space. This is a little bit more commercial, right? Because they're still selling the food and there's like those issues. But yeah. And I know people that are like free, I think it's freetarians is maybe what they call themselves, or like
Freegans
maybe, where they like eat, and it's mostly I heard about it when I was in New York, but because when companies do throw out food, they put a lot of times the edible stuff that's just like loaves of bread that didn't sell at Panera, they'll put in a different bag, a different color bag, so you can see through it, so people can see what's in it. And then people will go and will like make their meals out of whatever happens to be sitting on the sidewalk every other day.
Yeah, there's also a lot of like legislating against that in places, which is unfortunate. You know, that it is illegal to go through trash in some places and all of that, which is horrible.
Or the places that will just, pour horrible chemicals on all the food they're throwing out.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is harmful.
Yeah.
Capitalism.
Yeah.
Alex, I know that you're a GBBO fan, so my question is, do you have a favorite person? And if you were going to be a contestant, is there any, like, one thing that you feel like you'd have to know how to make before you went on? Like, I've always felt that in order to go on Great British Bake Off, you'd have to know how to make meringues and sponges and a few other things. You need to know how to make a good custard, that kind of thing. Is there any one particular thing you'd have to work on?
So my favorite person on Great British Bake Off is John Waite, who won the Series 3 in 2012, because he was brilliant at baking in the show, and also he is very cute. So it was like a delight to watch him bake things and be adorable while he's doing it. Also, I love him.
And he only almost cut off his finger once.
I know, right?
That's which one is John. Okay.
Yeah. I also really, really like him because since his time on Bake Off, he started his own cooking school and like he's got a nice life. But he also has been really, really honest about struggling with mental health on his Instagram and being transparent about anxiety and depression and how it affects him and how it's affected his career and his baking and all of this, and how he's worked through it and how he continues to work through it. And I think that that's something that's so important, to have somebody who has a huge following but also can be like vulnerable with people about stuff. Like, so that's why I like him, in addition to the fact that he makes good food and he's adorable. As far as things that I'd have to do, the British use a lot of different sponges than we do in the US.
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
Like, there's Victoria sponge, there's like Genoa sponge, there's like, I don't know, whatever sponges they make. So I don't know, I can't make all of those sponges from memory, and they all do, because they've been making them all the time. Like, we have like a cake is like, like we have angel food cake
really fancy,
or
pound
cake.
Food cake.
Right, exactly. So that, like, learning the sponges by heart would be something that I'd really have to work on, I think.
Sure, that makes sense. So, Alex, we have been collecting a recipe from each of our guests to share with our patrons on Patreon. So you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch and support us at any level to have access to this list of recipes that, when this episode comes out, will be a complete list of everybody's different recipes that come up both from our guests and then recipes that come up during our episodes. And Kay and I each have a recipe, at least one recipe that's up there. So I'm curious if you have a favorite recipe that you have found in your baking that we can then share with our patrons.
It's really, really rude to ask a 7 what their favorite of something is, because everything is my favorite. I don't have non-favorites, just like I only have best friends and I don't have regular friends. But my recipe is from John, the winner of the Great British Bake Off, and it is his pecan, cranberry, and dark chocolate pie which in
Ooh.
England is more like a tart. So it's in a tart crust, a tart pan, rather than what we would say an American pie pan is. You have to translate recipes between British English and American English sometimes. But it's so good. It has rye in it. Well, it says bourbon in the recipe, but I used rye when I make it, and I like the rye better because I think it gives a little bit more of a tang.
Mm.
So the recipe that I have shared with you, it has things that say that are British. So like castor sugar is just white sugar. Plain flour is all-purpose flour. Golden syrup is something we don't actually have an equivalent for here in the U.S. But the closest thing that we can get is just light corn syrup. And then light brown muscovado sugar is, you could either use light brown sugar or you can use that like sugar in the raw, the turbinado sugar. You can do, like, when I don't know a British ingredient, I ask my British friend, but if she's not available, I Google it. And I'm like, what is plain flour in the United States?
That makes sense.
It's flour that hasn't been decorated.
Right.
Exactly.
It's different than strong flour, which I think is like a better term than bread flour, because it just seems like, strong flour.
Yes, and we will make sure that in these recipes that we're sharing, as you probably have already been able to tell for those of you who are patrons, the recipes that we have been sharing, we have included the special notes of how to make them. So we'll make sure we include the like castor sugar, just regular sugar. This is, and the special, you can use rye instead of whiskey to get a little tang in your life. Yeah. So become a patron, get our recipes. Yay. Become a patron at the proper level and you get access to our unedited episodes and more. As we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is Joshua 24, verses 1 through 2a and 14 through 18. Joshua reminds the people of the many covenants God has made with them and how God has held up God's end of those covenants. He then instructs them that in response they need to remain faithful to God, and they agree. So I somehow read the whole Joshua part, including the part that is missing. And you know what? The part that is missing here is like all the colonization of Joshua, which is a big deal, particularly as Christians, that we like name that the entire book of Joshua basically is the Israelites going into already occupied and inhabited land and taking it over by force. This should sound familiar to those of us in the United States because that is literally what happened here. Settlers came in, colonizers came in, and intentionally took over and wiped out Native Americans and Native peoples, First Nations peoples, depending on where you are, how the language is a little bit different. So this is a big deal because the way that Joshua even is telling this story to the Israelites is in many ways like a whitewashing of the history, where it just like glances over the parts of like, yeah, and then we wiped out these people, and then we wiped out these people, but the emphasis is on like the goodness of God and the way that God has provided for the people. And I actually am wearing my, you can't actually see it, but it says, "The truth will not be whitewashed," which is was a fundraising campaign for the Great Plains Action Society this summer. But this is like that space where it feels like there is a whitewashing of the history. Look, we were, and it is true, like we were this poor family and descendants of Abraham and just this one person, and then somewhere along the road we became a nation, and then we went from being oppressed in Egypt and enslaved in Egypt to taking over and just like co-opting everybody and killing a whole bunch of people. And so that's something that as Christians, like, it's always important to me to name because we don't name it particularly clearly. And this retelling of the story feels a lot like in the Hunger Games, the way that the Capitol tells the story of the, whatever the name of their country is, but that the Capitol, Panem, thank you. But that they tell the story of Panem as we were, as the districts fighting against the capital and the capital being like marginalized and oppressed, and then winning the war against the districts, and then oppressing all the districts. And that is like not a clear telling of the capital, but that is like this, the way that it happens in this telling with Joshua, that it is just a family that's like trying to find a place to eat, which is not a criminal thing. Migration is important and natural. It's when it becomes a nation taking over another nation that then it gets a lot more complicated. Yeah. So that theme mixes in with verse 8, which is not technically in this passage, but I didn't notice it until 10
And
minutes
also,
ago.
we regularly comment on the missing verses because that's part of, acknowledging the hard parts and
and being
examining the lectionary. And it's completely intentional.
Yeah. And so that's the other piece of this, is that it is used and was used historically as like the manifest destiny, which is what was used by Christianity and by political powers to justify colonization. And just to be clear, like, this is not the same as Moana's people, who, for a long time before her and after her, who moved from island to island, who that's part of how they engaged with the land. Migration is not a problem. It is when people have come in and wiped out those who are already inhabiting the land. So
genocide is the problem.
Yeah, genocide is the problem. Keep Moanaing, and keep migration, but don't keep colonization. And don't go to people who have not had outside visitors. You will kill them, and it will be your fault, just to be clear.
So when we reach verse 16 in this passage, we read, "Then the people answered, 'Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods.'" So look, I want to believe that they're being entirely sincere at this point, but the thing is that I actually know a little something about how all this is going to go. And that makes it difficult for me to believe that they're entirely sincere, although maybe they were. I really should not judge. Judging is probably not the great thing to do here. But I have to say that I can, as I read this, hear a little bit of, "I am shocked to discover that there is gambling going on in this establishment," from the great movie Casablanca. Dear listeners, if you have not seen that movie, no, he was not shocked. He was not actually surprised in the least, because he was the one running the gambling. But he had to pretend to be, due to various other circumstances which would spoil the movie.
It's like that Devil Wears Prada quote: "Florals for spring, groundbreaking." Not actually groundbreaking.
Yes, exactly.
Indeed.
Our second reading for this episode is from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 20. The author instructs us to put on the defensive armor of God so that we may do God's work in the world, and asks the people to pray for him.
So one of the themes in this passage that is maybe obvious is militarization, right? The language that the author uses is about the armor of God. And I am particularly sensitive to the ways that we militarize things, both in a militarizing of police, right? There's been a lot of articles, there's a lot that is known about the harm that is caused by making police more military and making and that shift in the dynamic of police as like against the community rather than for the community safety, which is a whole complicated thing that we've talked about on this podcast in the past. Particularly, I think Elle's episode, we talked about that a lot, and so we'll link to that for you all just as a reminder. But also there's this space of like conservative Christianity using scripture to justify, or like pretending to use scripture and faith to justify the military and police and those sorts of things. I was at a council meeting the other day and somebody talked about Moses requesting law and order. I think they were maybe trying to talk about the Ten Commandments. I ended up giving, and I'll link to the like tweet summary of it, I ended up giving a like, here's the actual history of Moses and law, and the reality of time and again, Moses' life is saved and Moses' actions are against what is legal in that time. Well, and I was thinking as we like dive into the verses, I was thinking in verse 13 where we read, "Therefore take up the whole armor of God so that you may be able to withstand on that evil day and have done everything to stand firm." And thinking about in the Expanse, the Martians are like the big military power compared to the United Nations of Earth and Luna, the moon, which have all been colonized, and there's people in the asteroid belt and all that stuff. But the Martian, like, heavy-duty armor suits, literally, like, you wear them and you're, like, indestructible. I mean, you could still be destroyed by, like, nuclear weapons or whatever, but, like, most guns just, like, bounce right off of you. And they call them, like, the Goliath Mark suits, which is its own biblical reference. But that feels like the way that we're talking about the armor of God, of, like, that just, like, huge layer of protection. And the Martians, they also come with weapons, but that sort of, like, protection that happens so that we can stand. And, like, literally, like, somebody could, I think, be, like, severely injured, and the like, machine, because of how the armor is built, it would, like, keep them standing, which is a fascinating piece as well.
Cool.
I think. I'm not 100% positive on that last part, but I've been working my way through The Expanse, which our listeners will notice in the last, like, 2 months of episodes.
Yeah. In verse 15, we read, "As shoes for your feet, put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace." I love that this is just generally open-ended, and, you know, it's wear what works for you. Like, you're going to have this job, so wear something appropriate. Don't wear shoes that make you angry or frustrated or uncomfortable if you're going to go out and proclaim the gospel of peace. None of that is going to help. If wearing steel-toed Doc Martens puts you in the mood to kick some butt, maybe you don't want to wear those when you're going out to share the gospel of peace either.
But my rainbow chacos are good.
Oh, that sounds excellent, yes. And I do one of the things I appreciate about the October Day books by Shannon McGuire is that she does actually think about these things. And when she knows that she's going somewhere as she solves her various supernatural mysteries and crimes, if she believes that there's a chance she'll get into a fight, she does intentionally put on sneakers or boots or something like that that she can move in. And she's always been very practical, and I appreciate that. And I think that this is excellent life advice in general, like wear shoes appropriate to the occasion is a perfectly reasonable piece of life advice for the Bible to give. And personally, I prefer flats because I'm 5'11" and I don't usually need the help getting taller. So,
also, shoes can be super transgressive too. You know, like what, you know, there's all sorts of things, anecdotes from seminary about, you know, a professor of Emily and I's that got yelled at for wearing sandals in the pulpit because she was a lady, and that was inappropriate for a lady to wear sandals with an alb.
Yeah.
But why?
Jesus wore sandals?
Yeah, and the number of us who have, like, gone barefoot in worship.
Right.
Not in the pandemic. But,
yeah. Or also, like, you know, me wearing heels into a pulpit is transgressive. Like, it opens up peace in a different way for different people.
Sure.
Our gospel reading for this episode, and our final gospel reading in this series of Jesus Loves You, is John chapter 6, verses 56 through 69. Most of the crowd leaves Jesus, horrified that he seems to be speaking of cannibalism, and the disciples point out that few will follow him if he continues this teaching. Jesus asks why the disciples stayed, and Peter says, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of everlasting life."
Since we're all Lutheran pastors here, can I ask, did you all have the tune go with that last line in your head when you heard it?
Always.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good.
Lord,
just checking.
to whom shall we go? I can't ever sing. I don't understand why I am the one to break into song.
Go? You have the words of eternal life. Alleluia, alleluia.
I love
For
that.
those who aren't Lutheran, I will clarify that that's a standard piece of service music in Lutheran churches.
Yes, and I love that somebody else picked up, because I'm frequently the one who, like, breaks into song on this podcast, but the one with actual, like, voiciness is Kay, so that was a lovely, can't wait to hear.
I'm also kind of surprised that you haven't
foundations.
started singing Rise and Shine and Give God the Glory, Glory, given the episode that we're on.
I mean, it's true. It's true, I have not yet. I don't know if I will. I mostly sing that to, like, 3-year-olds.
So about our mental age is what you're saying.
I mean, anyway, so the theme of this episode is cannibalism.
The theme of this passage, not the episode.
Oh,
No, we didn't do a whole episode about cannibalism.
I mean, we might get there, goodness knows, but that's not the deep dive
Not
today.
yet. The theme of this passage is cannibalism, and I'm curious, what we think Jesus tastes like. We talked about it a little in the deep dive, but
I'm pretty
curious,
obsessed
what
with
does Jesus
cannibalism.
taste like?
I'm like,
Yeah.
like my husband kind of thinks I'm a cannibal sometimes because I'm so obsessed with it. I promise I'm not. But
Thank you for clarifying.
yeah, I just want to make that like very clear that that I'm not a cannibal. But when I was on CPE, doing CPE in seminary, we got to watch a surgery, and I got to watch an open heart surgery, like not in an operating theater, but like in the actual operating room, and it was the coolest thing in the world. But they use a sawzall to cut open your chest for that, like a medical grade one, and then they cauterize the flesh so that it doesn't bleed when you're on the heart lung machine. And cooking human flesh smells like bacon. Just FYI to anyone who is curious. And so it like I've never tried human flesh, but like, does it taste like bacon? I don't know. There are plenty of serial killers that we could ask for that, but
I've actually heard rumors that it tastes surprisingly like pork and is similar to pork in some other ways. But,
so that would fit with the bacon thing, and we could ask Hannibal Lecter sometime.
And also, like, humans use a lot of pork hormones for things, like for medicine. Like, insulin comes from pigs. Melatonin, the supplement that like to fall asleep. I think that it comes from pigs, doesn't it?
It's from pigs. I was thinking pigs too.
I mean, now it comes from pigs, yes, but like originally when we learned how to make insulin, we learned how to do it with sheep.
Okay.
Oh, didn't know that.
I didn't know that either, but I knew that it was pigs now. And then like melatonin, like that you take to sleep, is a hormone, and we harvest that from pigs and put it into pills. So I think like there's just a lot of similarity between humans and pigs.
Yeah.
In the way that
So
we
is
like
melatonin not kosher?
I don't know. Oh.
It wouldn't be, I guess.
Yeah.
Unless there's more than one type of
There could be different ways to get it, but I know like a majority comes. You can probably buy kosher melatonin.
Yeah.
I am not obsessed with cannibals, and I would just like to say that the one opinion I have about what Jesus does or does not taste like is that as a child, when I was first given the wine for communion, my immediate thought was children's Tylenol, and I have not been able to think of anything else while taking communion with wine ever since. So Jesus does not taste like children's Tylenol. Please don't do that to your children.
That is fantastic. I think that our question about like the cannibalism aspect of does Jesus taste like bacon is a great question also for our sister podcast, Horror Nerds at Church, which
probably a better question
much
for
more
them.
along their lines.
Right. Which will at some point, probably tackle the Silence of the Lambs series and
I'm sure
get those questions answered. So I eat lots of garlic, and one time in my first call, we usually used naan for communion, and parishioners would go buy it, and at some point they were buying it, and it looked like regular naan. After 2 Sundays of this particular naan for communion, somebody came up to me and was like, "Is there garlic in the naan?" And it was like, it said plain naan, but had garlic like in the ingredient list. I hadn't noticed it.
Because you're garlic.
That's how much garlic
tolerant.
you eat.
Yeah. So like I totally didn't register for me. Somebody who doesn't like garlic noticed it and was just like, and when we were talking about it afterwards, was like, yeah, I just thought like maybe there was like a lesson to be learned of like sometimes Jesus doesn't taste great. Like, right? Sometimes
Jesus
the
is trying to
gospel
keep
not
Jesus safe from vampires.
palatable, or trying to stay safe from vampires. Yeah, but so that was my favorite, like, when Jesus tastes unexpected.
I've had Jesus almost kill me twice, actually. So I'm allergic to cinnamon, like anaphylaxis reaction allergic to cinnamon. And when I was working at church camp as a college student, we did this like passion walk where we like reenacted the passion, and they had bread and wine at the Last Supper, like, unconsecrated, whatever. It's a play. And I was one of the disciples, and the bread that week was a leftover cinnamon English muffin. Ooh. And like cinnamon raisin English muffin. And I didn't know this at the time. No one knew. Like, it was just whatever bread the kitchen people left out for us. And so I ate the bread, and I was like, oh no, there's cinnamon in here. but like I was like in the middle of a show, so I couldn't like just spit out. Like, you can't spit Jesus out. Like,
Okay, Alex, for future reference, and for those listening, I will say that I think if you're about to have an anaphylactic reaction to him, Jesus wants you to spit him out.
well, I also like I don't believe that God would have protected me from anaphylaxis just because it was Jesus. Like I don't like, but so what I did.
That is also true.
I kept it in the side of the corner of my cheek until the next scene where we walked and we like fell asleep and prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. And when I fell asleep, I spat it out under a tree. But then in this current call that I have, we use real bread and somebody made it with cinnamon. And again, same thing, like no one knew and there was cinnamon in it. So I ate it without knowing. I did go into the sacristy during the like final hymn and spat Jesus out and then respectfully sprinkled those bits on the ground after worship. But don't put things in communion bread that people could potentially be allergic to. Like that's why I think like it's best practice just to use like wheat and water.
The plainest ordinary bread that you can.
Yeah. Also, so like those are some great like horror story versions of what Jesus tastes like. But I have loved having Jesus taste differently throughout the pandemic. But I also like remember in seminary, Alex, we for Easter Sunday, I don't know if we actually experienced both of these, but the tradition was champagne and angel food cake. I don't think we ever had angel food cake.
We never had angel food cake, no.
But I remember hearing about like the golden days of, champagne and angel food cake for Easter, for like the day of kind of version of the Easter celebration. And that was always like a fun and celebratory and like, yeah, because it's Easter and the resurrection and champagne and angel food cake.
Yeah. I am totally up for having, Jesus be pancakes. That seems like a perfectly reasonable option. It's morning. I'm good with that.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a like tasty Jesus?
Me?
You don't have to. Yeah.
I mean, I like my mom made Jesus for my for my ordination, and it was really good. But it also was like it didn't follow my own advice, right? Which was it did follow my advice, but didn't. So my mom makes this this recipe is like from the 90s, from Taste of Home magazine, like back when that was a big thing, and like for country women in the Midwest, and this recipe it's like a sweet bread. Like the dough is a sweet enriched dough, and then it has this like almond glaze on top. She didn't put the almond glaze on for my ordination, so it didn't have like allergens in it, but it was really good. Like it was like, think like Hawaiian bread, but homemade and better.
Ooh.
Excellent.
Yeah. Yeah.
We, at TLA, we did Hawaiian bread and grape juice and before the pandemic.
She also didn't bake it full. Like, I like bread that's a little underbaked. Like, don't let any, like, Mary Berry would kill me, but like, I like a little chew. Yeah, I like a little chew in my bread. So I was like, Mom, don't bake this too much. And so it was like a nice, chewy, sweet Jesus at my ordination.
Then as we dive into the verses, well, in verse 62, Jesus asks, then what if you were to see the human one ascending to where they were before? And so then the response, I think it's a little absurd that the response to people are concerned about cannibalism is, yeah, but what if the human one is like Superman? Like, those don't seem like the same kinds of offensive.
Like, is he saying that cannibalism will turn you into Superman? Because that's a whole different conversation, and yeah.
That is a different thing that I hadn't thought of. Cannibalism turning us into Superman.
Superheroes generally become superheroes through some encounter with, like, chemicals or bugs or eating the wrong thing.
I'm just going to throw out there that I'm pretty sure that if cannibalism turned you into being able to fly, like, we would know by now. I don't think that would be a secret.
I mean, yes. I guess.
You sound kind of disappointed, Emily. I'm a little concerned about that.
I got kind of excited about the idea of, like, communion can turn me into a superhero.
I mean, I'm pretty sure Jeffrey Dahmer did not fly.
True.
Yeah,
like, we would
if
know.
He had,
yeah.
It
would have made the news.
That's true.
Also, he might have escaped.
Right.
Also true. I mean, cannibalism.
Yeah, okay, so that was a fun turn. Sorry, I didn't expect it to go that way. In verse 68, we read, Simon Peter answered Jesus, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. Or, as Emily prefers, everlasting life. You choose your favorite word. That's fine. I'm pretty sure, reading this, that if vampire lore had existed in biblical Palestine, that Peter was basically totally thinking at this point that he was going to become a vampire. Like, he went straight from cannibalism to, oh, great, we're going to have eternal life. And I don't know how else you do that. Yeah. Thankfully, vampire lore was really not a thing in biblical Palestine. That came along a little later. If you want the very quick 30-second rundown on vampire lore, basically, if you took Vlad the Impaler, who was a nobleman in 1400s Transylvania, who... Well, when you get the nickname the Impaler, it's usually because you're killing people by impaling them, and there were a lot of people. And he was doing that to the Muslims, which is why he got to be famous, because the other Christians in the area really liked that. So,
because
yay.
Christians are terribly anti-Muslim. Yep.
Inter-religious war, yeah. And essentially, he did to the Muslims, because he lived on the border between where the Christians lived and where the Muslims lived. And so basically, he did to the Muslims what Sherman did to Georgia, is the short version of what I've been told. So Bram Stoker, a couple centuries later, took the legend of Vlad the Impaler and mixed it with some revenant lore, zombie lore, basically. That was the old-fashioned word for zombie. And came up with vampires, as we modernly know them. And if you want more information on vampire lore, there is a podcast that is actually called Lore, Lore. And their very first episode is titled They Made a Tonic, and it's all about where the story of vampires came from. As it happens, I'm married to someone who's very into this kind of thing, so
nice.
I learn all sorts of odd things that way. So, Alex, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Has anyone talked to you about Saint Honoré?
No, not yet. Well, maybe there's one episode. We're recording a little bit out of order, but I don't think that they would tell us about Saint Honoré either. So, tell us.
Oh my gosh! So, there's a patron saint of baking. That I know,
what is
right?
The feast day.
Oh, I couldn't tell you that. I would have to look it up. And I mean, you can.
We're not Catholic.
There's a thing called Wikipedia, Emily.
Could you tell us how to spell Honoré?
Yes, it's Honore.
Ah, there you go.
Honore. And he's the patron saint of baking. And he has a pastry, a French pastry, named the Saint Honoré pastry, that is like a very complex thing. It's difficult to make. People they made it on Bake Off once, actually, which is how I learned about Saint Honoré. Yeah. And Saint Honoré, there's a piping tip for the piping work on this pastry called the Saint Honoré piping tip. And presumably one should only use it to make this pastry. And so it's very French, very posh and regimented, but
yeah, it looks like leaves. It makes leaves.
That's
what it looks like for the piping tip.
Yeah. Huh. So I got an icon of Saint Honoré for Christmas a couple years ago that is hanging in my kitchen to watch over my baking.
That's awesome. That's actually Saint Honoré's feast day is my baptismal anniversary, I think.
Ah.
I'm not 100% positive which day is my baptismal anniversary. I may have accidentally lied on the paperwork to become a pastor.
Bishops, if you're listening, disregard.
I'm less than convinced that Emily understands the definition of the word accidentally, but whatever.
I thought it was May 15th, and then I was like, I don't know. There's some places where it says May 16th and some where it says May 15th. So, but May 16th is Saint Honoré's feast day. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 14th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want to access our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. And on one final note, while this series may be over, Jesus still loves you.
Aww.
Truth. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Absolutely. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax
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 vobiscum.
vobiscum.